April 1945 was not a month of peace. It was the final, deafening death rattle of a decade of global conflict. For 6 years, the world had been defined by expansion and survival, but in these critical 60 days, the story became one of inevitable, violent collapse. In Europe, the final result was known. The great Allied armies, Western democracy, and Soviet communism had torn the heart out of the Third Reich, and the clock had finally run out on Adolf Hitler. Yet, as the Nazi regime crumbled into the streets of Berlin, the war itself refused to die. The very nature of victory created a terrifying ideological chasm between Stalin's ambitions and Churchill's fears, threatening to exchange one conflict for the next. This was the profound contrast. While one tyrant hid in his bunker, his partner in the Axis, the Japanese Empire, was preparing a defense defined not by surrender, but by mass fanaticism. Victory in the West came with the dawn of a complex political rivalry. Victory in the East would require a violence the world had never conceived. How would these two oceans of conflict, the political collapse in Europe and the blood-soaked islands of the Pacific, finally converge to conclude the greatest war in human history? The crossing of the Rhine was the moment the Western Allies transformed from invaders into conquerors. It was defined by the clashing styles of two titans: the meticulous, methodical General Montgomery, who meticulously planned Operation Plunder, a massive airborne assault and river crossing that left nothing to chance. Contrasting this grand, slow buildup was the audacious speed of General George Patton. Refusing to be sidelined, Patton executed a brilliant, opportunistic flank attack near Oppenheim, using minimal resources to force a swift, unofficial crossing under the cover of darkness. He broke the German lines not by brute force, but by sheer audacity. Once across, the German defenses, already stripped bare for the Eastern Front, fractured completely. The two armies, Patton's racing columns and Montgomery's massed forces, drove inward, executing a giant, deadly pincer movement. The target was the Ruhr industrial heartland, and the result was the catastrophic Ruhr pocket. It was here that the scale of the collapse became evident. The trap successfully encircled Army Group B, ultimately capturing an astounding 430,000 German soldiers. It was the single largest capture of enemy troops by Western forces during the entire war. The fate of the Reich was no longer a question of if the Allies would win, but how fast they could collect the pieces. While the Wehrmacht dissolved into disorganized bands on the surface, beneath the shattered streets of Berlin, the architect of the war was undergoing his final, terrifying descent into dilution. Reclused within the granite walls of the Führer bunker, Hitler's world was reduced to the map on his table. Yet his orders retained a horrifying scope, prioritizing the destruction of his own nation over its salvation. The man who had promised the German people 1,000 years of glory now decreed their utter ruin. This nihilism was codified in the infamous Nero Decree, March 19, 1945, a scorched earth policy demanding the immediate demolition of all military, transportation, communication, and food facilities throughout the Reich. It was an explicit command for national suicide, an act of spite against a German people he deemed unworthy of survival for failing to achieve his impossible victory. When his armaments minister Albert Speer finally protested the madness of leaving a devastated nation unable to feed itself, Hitler's chilling response cut through the final rational objection. If the war is lost, the people will be lost also. There is no need to take into consideration the basis of the most primitive existence for later on. The chilling moral gravity of this decree cannot be overstated. It was the ultimate betrayal. Having led Germany to catastrophe, Hitler sought to ensure that if he could not rule it, no one else would inherit anything but ash. The greatest moral clarity of the entire conflict was delivered not by a battle won, but by an atrocity unveiled. On April 4, 1945, the 4th Armored Division of Patton's Third Army stumbled upon Ohrdruf, a satellite camp of Buchenwald. What they discovered went beyond the darkest warnings, evidence of unimaginable sadism. Skeletal corpses, a gallows, and a pile of partially burned bodies where victims had been murdered days earlier to conceal the crime. The news of the discovery reached Supreme Commander Eisenhower, who understood immediately the need to document this evil beyond any shadow of a doubt. He personally visited Ohrdruf, and what he witnessed moved him to an unprecedented command. "I have never felt able to describe adequately the sights I saw," he later wrote. To prevent future generations from dismissing the horror as mere propaganda, Eisenhower ordered every nearby unit, including the press corps, to visit the camps. But the most potent confrontation with reality was reserved for the German populace. In nearby Weimar, Eisenhower ordered American troops to march the local citizens through the liberated Buchenwald concentration camp. These Germans were forced to witness the evidence of their nation's crimes: the ovens, the torture rooms, and the piles of dead. This deliberate, powerful act served a dual purpose. It silenced any pretense of ignorance and provided the ultimate visceral justification for the war. The fight was not merely for territory, but to exterminate the evil revealed in those wretched grounds. As the Wehrmacht dissolved in Europe, the war simultaneously raged on another planet entirely: the unforgiving islands of the Pacific. To truly understand the final terrifying months of the war, we must dramatically shift our gaze from the German heartland to the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima. The fighting there served as a bloody, disturbing prologue to everything that came next.
The image is perhaps the most famous of the war: 6 Marines raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi. But the reality behind the symbol was a meat grinder. The Japanese defense system, utilizing deep bunkers and interlocking fire, turned every foot of ground into a deadly siege. Unlike the Germans, who often surrendered en masse, the Imperial Army fought literally to the last man. When the battle concluded, the numbers were a cold shock. The United States suffered 6,825 dead. The Japanese garrison of 22,000 was almost totally annihilated, losing 21,703 soldiers. This level of fanatical resistance was the crucial contrast with the European theater. If the conquest of a tiny volcanic island demanded such a grotesque toll, what would the invasion of the Japanese mainland itself require? Iwo Jima delivered a clear, chilling warning to American planners. The end of this war would be paid for in blood, on a scale that dwarfed the cost of Europe. The next objective was Okinawa, an island strategically located just 350 miles from mainland Japan. For this invasion, dubbed Operation Iceberg, the United States assembled a force whose scale was staggering, exceeding even the D-Day landings. This was the peak of American industrial and military might, a floating city comprising over 1,600 ships spearheaded by 40 aircraft carriers and transporting an amphibious army of more than 200,000 soldiers. When the 10th Army landed on the western beaches on April 1st, a day of irony that was no joke, the initial landing was met with a silence so profound it was suspicious. The massive force met zero opposition. This unsettling quiet was not a sign of surrender, but a brilliant, terrifying tactical misdirection by the Japanese commander, General Mitsuru Ushijima. Learning from the disastrous defense of Iwo Jima, Ushijima had abandoned the coastline. Instead, he withdrew his entire force deep into the island's mountainous south, constructing an intricate, layered defense of fortified caves, concrete tunnels, and artillery positions. The goal was simple: to avoid the crippling pre-invasion naval bombardment and force the Americans to fight a brutal, close-quarters infantry war of attrition. The seemingly empty beaches masked an invisible enemy waiting patiently, ensuring that the bloodiest battle of the Pacific theater was fought not on the water, but in the mud. If the defense of Okinawa in the mud was terrifying, the defense from the air was pure, calculated horror. Unable to match the sheer industrial output of the American Navy, the Imperial High Command introduced its most desperate and fanatical weapon, the Kamikaze. This was not merely suicide, but a state-sanctioned national religious commitment named after the divine wind that saved Japan from the Mongols centuries earlier. The mission was simple: bypass the ship's defenses and plunge a bomb-laden plane directly into the vessel's heart. For Operation Iceberg, the Japanese committed almost 2,000 aircraft to this terrifying new tactic. The true horror began on April 6th with the launch of Operation Chrysanthemum, the first of 10 mass kamikaze attacks against the Allied fleet. Wave after wave of aircraft, many flown by teenage pilots, targeted the vital picket destroyers and carriers protecting the main invasion force. The sea became a graveyard of steel and burning aviation fuel. The effectiveness was sickeningly high. Over the course of the battle, the kamikaze attacks resulted in the largest number of naval casualties the U.S. Navy ever suffered in its history. The final, devastating statistics paint the picture. 36 Allied ships sunk, 368 vessels damaged, and nearly 5,000 sailors killed. The fanatical resistance was not only proving highly effective, but was psychologically breaking the men who believed they had finally left the horrors of the German front. This dramatic tension, where logic and technology were countered by zealotry, turned the waters around Okinawa into the most lethal place on the planet. In the spring of 1945, amidst the global carnage, the very foundation of the Allied coalition was shaken by a sudden, devastating loss. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the only president most Americans had ever known and the very architect of the Allied war machine, was failing. Despite his worsening condition, he had recently returned from the Yalta Conference, committed to securing a lasting peace through the nascent United Nations, his final great vision for the world. Then, on April 12th, the news broke. While sitting for a portrait in Warm Springs, Georgia, FDR collapsed from a cerebral hemorrhage and died. The emotional pause was absolute. The world stopped. Churchill wept, Stalin sent condolences, and across the United States, an entire generation felt orphaned. The man who guided the nation through the Depression and the global war was gone, leaving an unfinished victory and a world poised on the brink of a new power struggle. The historical pivot came immediately, ushering in the era of Harry S. Truman. A man utterly unprepared for the crushing weight of the office, Truman had been president for mere weeks when he was informed of the war's ultimate, most secretive weapon, the atomic bomb. This immediate, terrifying transfer of responsibility created an overwhelming sense of suspense. The new leader, unknown and untested, now held the power to end the war decisively or escalate it into unimaginable destruction. With the Ruhr pocket sealed, Eisenhower faced a critical strategic choice that would later fuel historical debate: prioritize the political prize of Berlin or neutralize the last credible military threat. He chose the latter. The advance shifted south, largely spearheaded by Patton's Third Army, not towards the Elbe, but towards Bavaria. The urgent task was twofold. First, dealing with the colossal humanitarian crisis of 430,000 prisoners and millions of displaced civilians. Second, destroying the pervasive German myth of the Alpine Redoubt. This rumored mountainous fortress, supposedly stocked with fanatical SS units ready for a last stand, was a piece of intelligence Eisenhower could not ignore. By committing American forces to eliminating this phantom threat and sweeping the southern sector, the Supreme Commander achieved two vital objectives. He destroyed the final cohesive German resistance in the south and, crucially, solidified the line of demarcation with the Soviets. This decision, to trade the prestige of Berlin for military reality, provides the definitive strategic rationale for the path to victory in the West. With the Western Allies choosing to halt at the Elbe, the political and military fate of the Reich's capital was thrust solely into the hands of the Soviet Union. For Joseph Stalin, the capture of Berlin was more than a military objective. It was a matter of overwhelming national prestige and a final, visceral act of revenge for the barbarity of 1941. He had three core objectives: secure the capital, seize the scientific and industrial assets, and, crucially, establish geopolitical dominance in Eastern Europe before the West could intervene.
Stalin set the stage for the final act on April 16th, launching the massive Soviet assault across the Oder and Neisse rivers. The scale was biblical, massing approximately 2.5 million troops, 6,250 tanks, and 7,500 aircraft. The imbalance of power against the ragged German defenders was staggering. But Stalin, ever the ruthless puppet master, intentionally fostered a fierce internal rivalry between his two greatest marshals, Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev. By allowing both commanders to race for the capital, Stalin guaranteed maximum speed, ferocity, and bloodlust. The anticipation of this final desperate sprint fueled the entire Eastern Front. For the Soviets, the battle was the culmination of 4 years of unimaginable suffering. For the Germans, it was the arrival of the terrifying, inevitable Russian steamroller. The world held its breath as the two immense pincers closed in on the bunker. The Soviet race for Berlin quickly encountered a formidable barrier, the Seelow Heights. This was not merely a hill, it was the final, strongest defensive line protecting the capital, transformed by Field Marshal Heinrici into a series of trenches, anti-tank ditches, and minefields. For 4 brutal days, beginning on April 16th, Marshal Zhukov's First Belarusian Front hurled itself against this position. The battle was a bloody, costly nightmare, a frontal assault where Soviet forces paid a terrible price for every foot of elevation gained against the desperate German defenders. The opening salvo for this desperate struggle, and indeed for the city itself, began on April 20th, Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday. The sound was not a traditional drumbeat of war, but a continuous, earth-shaking howl. The Soviets unleashed an artillery barrage of unprecedented fury, employing their terrifying mobile rocket launchers, the Katyusha. Nicknamed Stalin's organs by the Germans for their signature shrieking sound, the rockets delivered saturation fire that was less about precision and more about annihilating hope. The psychological impact of the Katyushas, coupled with the relentless advance of the Russian steamroller, made the battlefield tactile and intense. The Germans, fighting with minimal support and almost no air cover, were pulverized. The fall of the Seelow Heights on April 19th cost the Soviets tens of thousands of casualties, but it achieved its dreadful purpose. It blew the final hole in the eastern defenses, opening the last terrible 20 miles of scorched earth to the inner city. The path to the bunker was now clear. Amidst the chaos of the Reich's final days, a single historic event briefly illuminated the sheer scale of the Allied victory and served as a powerful, albeit fleeting, moment of unity. On April 25, 1945, near the German town of Torgau, the symbolic meeting on the Elbe occurred. The forward reconnaissance patrol of the U.S. 69th Infantry Division met with troops of the 58th Guards Division on the shattered remains of the Torgau Bridge. This was the physical realization of the war's objective, the convergence of the Western and Eastern fronts. The scenes captured for the world were immediately iconic. American and Soviet soldiers, distinct in uniform and demeanor, embracing, sharing cigarettes, and exchanging small, priceless gifts for the cameras. It was a brief, beautiful moment of spontaneous, genuine brotherhood between men who had endured years of unimaginable suffering, but had finally secured the common goal. Yet, even in the joy, the foreshadowing was stark. The two armies were fundamentally different, not just in language, but in ideology. The handshake at Torgau marked the official end of Germany's resistance as a unified state, but it simultaneously established the point of contact between two emerging, competitive superpowers. The celebration was short-lived, the common enemy was gone, and the line drawn at the Elbe River swiftly transformed from a point of friendly contact into the defining, tense border of a new conflict, the Cold War. As the sounds of Soviet artillery became a constant, suffocating reality above, the man who had plunged the world into war prepared for his final, self-imposed climax. Isolated in the Führer bunker, Hitler received the news that solidified his ultimate decision, the ignominious end of his fascist partner, Benito Mussolini, whose body had been publicly mutilated. Hitler was determined to avoid such a spectacle. He would not be captured. He would not be humiliated. In his final hours, the bunker transformed into a macabre stage for a political and personal finale. Hitler married his longtime mistress, Eva Braun, in a short, cynical civil ceremony. He then dictated his political testament, expelling Himmler and Göring for treason and appointing Admiral Dönitz as his successor, a desperate attempt to maintain a facade of legitimate authority until the very end. On the afternoon of April 30th, with the Red Army only hundreds of yards away, Hitler and Eva Braun retreated to his private study. The subsequent moments delivered the narrative payoff, a cyanide capsule and a gunshot. In accordance with his orders, the two bodies were hurriedly carried up through the emergency exit, drenched in gasoline, and set alight by his remaining aides. The stench of burning flesh mixed with the dust of the collapsing city. The ultimate micro-story of the war concluded not with the grand battle, but with the quiet, cowardly suicide of the villain, a man who became his own final prisoner.
The suicide of Adolf Hitler did not bring immediate silence, but it did remove the command structure holding the final fragments of Berlin together. For 3 more days, the battle raged on, fought by the last fanatical defenders, desperate SS remnants, teenage Hitler youth, and aged Volkssturm militias who fought with the energy of despair. The Soviets, fueled by revenge and the knowledge of imminent victory, pressed toward the political monuments.
The symbolic climax was the battle for the Reichstag building, a ruin already saturated with historical significance. On May 1st, after a brutal struggle, 2 Soviet soldiers raised the red flag atop the shattered dome, the definitive visual testament to the defeat of Nazi Germany. That same day, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's last true loyalist, committed his final horrifying act, poisoning his 6 children before committing suicide with his wife. The next day, May 2nd, the Berlin garrison issued its final surrender order. The guns, after months of continuous roar, finally fell silent. The struggle had been replaced by the chilling, utter stillness of resolution. The roar of the Soviet victory was immediately followed by a chilling, somber reckoning. The capture of Berlin had come at a frightful cost that is often overshadowed by the larger narrative of collapse. In the final 2 weeks of fighting for the capital, the Soviet army sustained devastating losses. At least 80,000 soldiers killed and over 280,000 wounded. The Red Army had achieved its victory, but the price was etched in the vast hidden cemeteries surrounding the city. In the immediate aftermath, the city, reduced to rubble, was a humanitarian catastrophe. Millions of terrified civilians, many without food or water, huddled in basements while the victors struggled with the logistical nightmare of imposing order. This environment of total breakdown became the stage for a period of terrible retribution. Fueled by years of German brutality on the Eastern Front, Soviet troops, many of whom had seen their own homes and families destroyed by the Nazis, committed widespread atrocities against the German population. This sobering reality is crucial to the historical account. The end of the Third Reich, while a moral victory for humanity, was not a clean one. The liberation of Europe was simultaneously stained by the acts of revenge and violence committed by the conquerors, cementing the moral complexity of the conflict's final days and leaving a legacy of lasting bitterness. The collapse of Berlin triggered a chain reaction of surrender across Europe. Even before the capital formally fell, German forces in Italy had capitulated on May 2nd. The culmination of the Western campaign arrived 2 days later, on May 4th, when Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg, representing the new, fleeting German government, met with Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery on the Lüneburg Heath. There, in a simple tent, the surrender of all German forces in northwest Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands was signed. This was immediately followed by the final, formal signing of unconditional surrender by all remaining German forces at Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims on May 7th. The news sparked an immediate collective explosion of joy. Though some territories like the Channel Islands would only be liberated later, the war in Europe was fundamentally over. The contagious euphoria peaked on May 8th and May 9th in the Soviet Union, officially declared Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day. Crowds poured into the streets of every Allied city from Moscow to New York, but nowhere was the emotion more potent than in London. The streets were jammed with celebrating citizens, culminating in the iconic sight of Winston Churchill standing on the balcony of the Ministry of Health, greeting the massive crowds. This long-awaited moment of profound emotional payoff finally delivered the resolution the world had craved for 6 grueling years. VE Day was a release of joy, but for the leaders in Washington and London, the relief was immediately tempered by the unfinished business in the East. As Winston Churchill somberly warned in his address, Japan, guilty of greed and treachery, remains unpunished. The entire machinery of the Allied war effort, now free from Europe, pivoted toward the vast, deadly expanse of the Pacific. The final, grinding chapter of this shift was written on the island of Okinawa. Despite the kamikaze attacks and the enormous casualty rates, the battle finally concluded on June 22, 1945. The human cost was horrific. Nearly the entire Japanese garrison, around 100,000 soldiers, died defending the island, refusing to surrender. The Americans suffered over 12,000 dead and nearly 50,000 total casualties. The price paid for a single island barely 60 miles long provided the ultimate, most terrifying proof of the fanaticism awaiting the Allies. This result plunged military planners into a strategic crisis climax.
The next step was the invasion of the Japanese mainland, a two-phase assault codenamed Operation Downfall. The first phase, Operation Olympic, the invasion of the southern island of Kyushu, was scheduled for November 1945. Based on the resistance at Okinawa, projections for the cost of Kyushu alone were staggering, ranging from 40,000 to 300,000 American casualties, with Japanese losses expected to be in the millions. This terrifying statistic created a curiosity gap that demanded a new strategic approach. Truman's commanders informed him that a traditional invasion would be the bloodiest operation in history, guaranteeing the death of hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers and Japanese civilians alike. The grim arithmetic of the Pacific War had now become untenable, forcing the new American president to confront the technological solution of unprecedented moral and destructive power. Circling back to the White House, the immense moral and military weight of the Pacific crisis rested squarely upon the shoulders of Harry T. Truman. Thrust into the presidency only weeks earlier, he was now confronted with the ultimate paradox. The price of a traditional victory against Japan had become strategically unacceptable. The potential for hundreds of thousands of Allied and millions of Japanese casualties for the invasion of Kyushu alone necessitated a decision that would redefine warfare forever. Churchill in his victory address had noted that America possessed the technology capable of forcing surrender. This was the final inescapable fact of the war, the successful test of the atomic device in the New Mexico desert. The responsibility to deploy this power, the power to unleash an element that bypassed armies and destroyed entire cities in a single flash, belonged solely to the new, untested commander-in-chief. The resolution to the Second World War was no longer a matter of men and machines or of strategic positioning. It was a matter of physics. The age of conventional warfare was over, and the world was about to be remade by the terrible dawn of the nuclear era.